Good morning, everyone, and welcome to another 50 Acres Academy webinar, and I hope you are all well. It's raining where I am, but I'm sure you are all over the place. Today is an interesting topic, I think. It's looking really, I suppose, trying to drill down and think a little bit more coherently, perhaps a little bit more dispassionately, if that's possible, about the implications of the Trump victory in terms of political trends, engagement, and communications. What we might be able to learn, what we might be able to take out from what he did, and some of the implications for our own domestic political environment as well. Now, if people have got a question, you can probably see in the control panel on the almost on the very bottom, it says questions. If you have a question, please just pop it into the box and I will respond to them as we proceed through the discussion. That's totally fine, or you can wait until the end, but very happy for people just to raise a thought or a comment or a question as we go through. So that's totally fine. So welcome, and let's get started and have a think about this issue, which is quite fascinating, really. It's one of my favourite topics. So really, what are we thinking about today? One of the things, these are the sort of areas that I wanted to explore, and these are what we're going to touch on. So what's happening in elections that throw up results like Brexit, One Nation and Trump? Why aren't pollsters able to make accurate predictions anymore? Which is really quite fascinating. What this whole word disruption, what does it mean? What do people talk about it, but what is it? In fact, what are the implications for government engagement in Australia? And how can we learn from the Trump campaign? Is it, obviously it's possible to learn from anything, or certainly to observe what's happened and perhaps make some observations that we might be able to learn from. How did the Trump team use communications, and why was it so successful? I'm not saying that we will become Donald Trump, but there are probably some things that we can probably reflect on. Before we kick off, I just wanted to share with you a few photos that I, like others, started to or have used from time to time. I just did that last week, actually. That's obviously a Snapchat image. And another one which was put out not long after he won, which was, comparison of his colour palette to raw chicken, which I thought was interesting. And another one, which was I saw some months ago, which I thought was interesting. I mean, Donald Trump has the potential to create a lot of emotion, and we clearly know that. So it's quite fascinating. So I thought that might amuse you to begin with. So let's have a think. Now, obviously, the election of Donald Trump to the office of the President of the United States of America will have an impact, obviously, on engagement and communications throughout the world, including Australia. It's already has done. We're talking about it now. So, how actually will it happen? What will the implications be? I suppose one of the things that people are comparing this result to is Brexit and One Nation, and in many respects there is a lot of comparisons to be made there. Brexit was a fairly, guttural, gut level, gutsy, basic campaign, which was run, and I don't think that people necessarily understood the full implications. I think there was a lot of evidence just after Brexit when people were searching in the UK marketplace on Google, and they were saying, what is the EU? What does it mean if we leave the EU? People didn't really know what they were voting for, and obviously voting is not compulsory in either the United Kingdom or in the United States, which I think also plays a significant part on the results in both of those jurisdictions. But I think in some respects there are some comparisons there to be made about whether people understand or want to understand, or perhaps have the ability to understand even the depth of the implications of what they're doing and what they're voting for. So I suppose in Brexit, and as in the results of the resurgence of One Nation here in Australia, and also Donald Trump in the United States, I think there is some real interesting comparisons there in terms of the two of them, or the three of them, sorry. Really interestingly, just not long before the election in the States, Trump himself said there's going to be a lot of Brexit happening in about 2 weeks, Trump said in Florida. Remember that? Everyone went to bed. They said, oh, gee, I think it's not going to happen. And I said, it's going to happen. So, even the comparison didn't escape Mr. Trump himself, which is, of course, quite prescient in terms of what happened. I think, one of the things that people talk about is populism. And what does that mean? The rise of popular political leaders. Hitler was a popular political leader. Mussolini, coming off the back of almost unguarded, unchallenged, rhetoric. Populist leaders don't always have to be from the right, but the ones we're talking about here are from the right, and the recent resurgence has been from the right in a number of these places. So what is it? I suppose what I would say is that, voters need a narrative for their lives, including, someone to blame or someone to point the finger at for what's gone wrong in their own lives. So in the United States, a lot of people were pointing the finger at some of the states which expected to go for Hillary, where there'd been huge redundancies and industries going under over many, many years. And there was really no solution. There was no solution in sight. There was no end of the rainbow, no pot of gold. So people were looking for something to blame. It really wouldn't have mattered who that was. It wasn't the incumbent party. It was another alternative, and it happened to be Trump. He did it. He played the market very well, of course, but I think there is obviously something to be said in looking for someone to blame. Here in Australia, as in the United States or even in the UK, the issues that we're blaming people, or certain groups of people are blaming people about, is issues ranging from immigrants, politicians themselves, the Grady train, the gold pass, the travel pass, banks, the need for a bank royal commission, terrorism, whatever that means, the economy and it not going right or not being perfect. Medical bills in the United States. Here it's Medicare or Mediscare. So there are a lot of these things that people are looking to blame. They're simple issues, they're not complicated issues, but put together, there's a cacophony of noise and a cacophony of a need to find something to blame and someone to blame. Populist leaders or populist voices can stand out and pretend to be a solution, even though they probably don't offer a solution in reality. In the reality of the political system. So, why populism? I suppose US commentators have identified what they call a collapse of white identity. This doesn't mean those with just white skin. Obviously, I'm not trying to be covertly, a Trump supporter here. It's about really meaning the majority group that has traditionally enjoyed the privilege of being considered us rather than them. Some of you may have heard of the concept of the other. It's a similar sort of idea. It's no longer, it's no good anymore. It used to be better, and we want it to be better again. That's what happened in the US, and I suppose to some extent, I think that's what happened probably with the One Nation phenomena. Both, culturally and politically, people wanted it to be better. it was them that were the problem, whatever that means. So it's a sort of majoritarian backlash, if you like, the anger of those who are now slightly less powerful against the gradual erosion of their perceived privilege that they once had. In the States, that backlash fueled Donald Trump's candidacy, and now, against all the hundreds of predictions and polls, it made him president, which is even more profound and extraordinary and warrants, obviously, our examination. So, I suppose one needs to identify, particularly in this instance, and in the instance of Brexit, most certainly in those particular examples, but to some extent One Nation. I think the polls in those three instances didn't predict the results. I think we knew in Australia that the result was going to be tight. We knew that the rise of independence was going to be, there and happening, and certainly a big factor. I don't think that anyone predicted quite the rise in support for One Nation, but certainly people didn't predict the Brexit and Trump results. And I suppose we need to think about why that is. I think that a lot of people are now saying, data experts or psephologists or people who crunch this stuff suggest that, we trust that data analysis too much without grasping actually what limitations it does have. We can't predict precisely how everyone will vote in every seat, clearly, or every state in the US. And the potentially flawed assumptions of the people who build predictive models. And some of you may have heard there was one particular person who I think has predicted the last, 17 elections or something over 30-something years, who he was the only person who got it right. And I think there might have been one or two others that suggested a Trump victory, but there weren't many of them. I think, a lot of people suggest that both Brexit and in the US, the media commentators themselves couldn't foresee a time where Donald Trump could become president. In the UK, I don't think media commentators wanted to think or wanted to contemplate the United Kingdom pulling out of the EU, although they did respond and report on polls tightening and softening, etc. I think in both of those jurisdictions, obviously, the observations weren't accurate. And, did they tap into some of those sentiments when they saw some of those interesting votes? I think the other thing is, even with the best models, it's difficult to predict the weather, for example. Meteorologists won't predict weather more than 10 days out because there's so many small changes or other sorts of fluctuations. Those sorts of things can happen. In mathematics, it's called chaos. The chaos theory in politics as well. I can remember I worked on an election some years ago in the United Kingdom. I managed the London campaign. It was 76 seats that I was managing, and the beginning of the election, it was when I was working for the Labor Party, as you'd probably predict. I wasn't working with the Conservatives, and the beginning of the election, it was very expected from the polls that Labor would win. But through the campaign, a number of things happened. The leader of the Labor Party fell over on a beach, stumbled in the water. He looked like a bit of an idiot. A couple of other public appearances, he made a bit of a clown of himself. Those things, I think, helped to entrench in a public way with, punters that they weren't sure about him. And in the end, Labor didn't win against all predictions. So, small things, it's the chaos theory, I suppose. Small things can have a great impact on an election campaign that perhaps people, psephologists, observers, and the data crunchers don't necessarily. They're looking at their data. They're not looking at perhaps at the human dimensions or what people are saying. It was Neil Kinnock at the time, and the other thing that he said that he assessed it the day before. I can't remember what seat he was in, but he said people weren't looking me in the eye, and he knew, even though the polls were still saying he was going to win. So sometimes it's those gut feel things that data crunchers don't necessarily observe, and they're very hard to predict as well. But I suppose it's the observational powers of a journalist and the perception to drill into human sensitivities and sensibilities that data crunchers can't get. And perhaps we're moving away too far from that, I think. I think in terms of the polling, really, I suppose one of the other things that a lot of people are saying is a lot of Trump's voters, as in Brexit, and potentially here in Australia as well with One Nation, I think a lot of those voters either were sort of cynical about, I'm not sure if were cynical about, polling itself, pollsters if they managed to catch them, but were they telling the truth if they got them in the first place? They saw them as part of that same media elite, political elite, or the establishment that Trump was campaigning against, and it's a similar sort of phenomenon here in Australia and in Brexit. Something like that appears to also have happened in Britain, I think. And I think it's the same sense of rejection for that elite and those sort of data crunching experts that we're also seeing here in Australia, I think is very much the case. What we talked about before, and feel free to jump in with a question if someone's got a question. But what people are talking about here is disruption. Donald Trump was a disruptor. Pauline Hanson is a disruptor. And obviously the whole Brexit thing is also disruption. What's disruption? Well, it's a theory of change founded on panic, anxiety, and shaky evidence. That's a sort of pure definition, if you like. It's a new innovation, but without necessarily considering goals or results. People are talking about disruption, and they are embracing it as a concept, but it's in many respects the concept of innovation in new words and new terms. People used to talk about innovation; they're now talking about disruption, and I think in some respects it's a response to the enormous pressure we're all facing as a result of digital and technological overload. That fear comes from that very much so. People talking about this concept, disruption. It's attractive. It's sort of even slightly cool or groovy or sexy to say that you're a digital disruptor or you're a disruptor in an industry. But what is disrupting achieving? You can call yourself a disruptor. You can call yourself an influencer. You can call yourself any of these catchphrases. But I suppose it's about thinking about what that disruption achieves. So I think, yes, Trump is definitely a disruptor, but we need to think about what's behind that disruption and what's its agenda, what's its goal, where is it going. I think there's no doubt that both Brexit and One Nation and Trump have an agenda to some extent. I'm not sure whether it's fully formed. We all know that they're all conservative agendas. I'm not sure whether the implications of the Brexit no vote, or to leave the European Union, was fully thought through by the people who supported it. Similarly, even the Trump supporters thought there was very little chance that they would win, and I think that probably fully hit or started to hit Mr. Trump himself the day after the election, where you could see his face coming to grips with the fact that he's going to have to be president and not earn any money, and it'll be hard. So I think it is interesting to see what this concept is and how people are using it. So someone's just made a comment. I've heard the term post-truth used a bit. Is this similar to disruption? Yeah, I mean, I think, what does post-truth mean? Yeah, I've heard that term too. I think it's interesting that you've made that comparison. You know, in some respects, it's a term people are grasping. People are trying to work out what happened, why they didn't get it right, why they got it so badly wrong. Journalists from all over the place in lots of Western democracies. It's not the only place that it's happening. A lot of this sort of disruption is happening in in non-Western states as well. But I think in some respects that term is being used in a similar way. You're right. So, the implications, I suppose, here in Australia are really interesting. And this is a quote from the blog, The Conversation, which some of you may have picked up on occasionally and read. It's a really good platform. They said about Trump, Trump represents both the fears and aspirations of white working class Americans who are exhausted by dramatic changes to their country over recent decades. These Americans certainly want no more prudence in economic affairs and pragmatism in foreign policy. They want to call December 25th Christmas. Here in Australia, they probably want to call Australia Day Australia Day. They want to win wars. They want Americans to speak English. They want, in the words of Trump's campaign slogan, to make America great again. And in some respects, if you think about the implications of the One Nation resurgence or the Brexit victory in the UK, it's a similar sort of agenda. People are exhausted. They're not here. They weren't interested in the Prime Minister Turnbull's jobs and growth or digital revolution or whatever he wanted to call it. People weren't interested in that. What they're interested in was simple stuff, and Pauline Hanson voiced those simple messages. We'll talk about messages in a second about how they did that, but I think it is very much about the simplicity of how well these populist politicians really, reflected some of that stuff. So implications for Australia, well, I think, one of the things that I would say is they've embraced the populist at the expense of logic. It's not always logical to, adhere to a populist agenda. What's a populist agenda? It changes potentially from day to day. There's not a coherence about it necessarily. It's probably conservative, but it also has elements that are pulled from other things as well. It grabs hold of, things that are useful. It chops and changes. It moves. And I think that one of the things that I suppose governments have been doing in recent years is they've had to move and they've had to change their agendas very quickly. Years ago, governments were elected and were brought in with a pretty coherent platform. They tried to some extent, mostly, to implement it in the first term, and then they moved to consolidate it. And then the third term, they had to watch their back. And I think that really has, to some extent, really changed in recent years, and particularly in the last 12 months or so, we've really seen that really very much, taken a different gear. Liberal MP Andrew Hastie said just after Trump, we're moving into the unknown, and it's what politicians are thinking. They're scared. We've had Brexit, we've had the rise of One Nation, now we have Trump and the coalition. And I'd say, in fact, any politicians would be foolish to neglect this deeper truth about this, and that there is a silent majority. Well, silent in the sense that the pollsters couldn't reach them. Are they silent? It's an interesting point, but they certainly weren't silent at the ballot box. And in Australia, it's compulsory voting, so they're all voting, which is quite fascinating. So what I think is interesting, I suppose, is, governments talk about the need to listen to Australians in in the light of Trump and Brexit and the last election, One Nation's resurgence. We need to listen to Australians, and as a knock-on effect from that, we don't lead them any longer. We listen to them, but we don't lead them. So I suppose the question that I'd ask people is, what happens if what they think is awful or pretty bad? Do we not try to change that? For example, if everyone thinks that we should stop allowing Muslim immigration, for example, into Australia, do we agree with that? Obviously, I don't think I need to teach you all how to suck eggs, but it is an interesting concept how one deals with the perceived problems and fallout from these sorts of elections. And in your own home territory, you probably saw both parties grabbed a few pretty popular slogans just in the last sort of week or so after the Trump victory. How they interpret that and how they use that is going to be really fascinating in the next few months, years, on the run up to the next election. So I suppose the thing I think is interesting for us to think about before we wrap up in about 10 minutes, and again, if anyone's got any questions, please pop them in. How actually did he do it? Because we can see all those funny memes, we can see all those funny photos, we can laugh and we can cry and we can be fascinated and we can be amazed and we can be horrified, but actually how did it happen is quite interesting. I think Trump offers an alternative approach to communication. He's obviously worked to fill a void in the US, a cynicism void. He had very much a clear narrative. He had a master tagline and a story which he stuck to very much through the election campaign itself, and it went on for some considerable amount of time. He speaks the language of his audience. It was a simple language, and I think I saw some research which sort of said that Hillary's language was sort of aiming at a much higher brow, more educated audience. Trump's language was much more simplistic. He reframes every debate question into a language that he prefers and he's comfortable with. Writ large, the presidential debates, he's deliberately and decidedly different from his peers and the other candidates in both his style and his approach, and I think we saw that very clearly. So I think one of the biggest things that he achieved was reframing the negativity instead of defending against it. So instead of defending himself when people were attacking him for negatives, he changed the goalposts. If people accused him being racist, he said he's for security, wants to make people safer. When he was accused of being sexist, right through that election, when there was all those women that were coming out against him, he says he's not sexist, he's simply against imposed political correctness. And everyone, majority of people went, yeah, that's pretty reasonable. Whatever the issue, he might have said it was, locker room banter. Whatever the issue, Trump reframed the question of his own character and puts things into a much more favourable terms that helped him in terms of where he was at that moment, which obviously was helpful. So what was his strategy? Well, he communicated more effectively while exploiting the weaknesses and attacking the strengths of his opponent. That's what he did. He, even though when we listened to him in the debates, it was somehow nonsensical, but what we needed to do was remove ourselves from our own sense of what he was believing and seeing and what he is, what he represented, and thinking, actually, he's being pretty clear here. He's being pretty gutsy. He's got a lot of guts. If we were just an average Joe and a swinging voter in the States, we might have really liked what he was saying. So I suppose people weren't dispassionate enough and able to see that perhaps through the election, which is why we didn't read it right. I think one of the things he did really well was applying simplicity. He had a few very simple ideas and he repeated them a lot. His campaign broke every rule in the public relations rule book. Can you imagine? I can imagine the disaster management, the crisis management stuff that that you'd normally deal with if you had a guy like that behind you. I can remember when, again, the same election that I helped run in, or that I ran in the UK, one of my candidates in a marginal seat in London called me and said that his opponent, his Tory party Conservative opponent, wasn't prepared to debate him in any of the public debates, and they have a lot of them in the UK. And he had an idea that he was going to get a dead chicken and nail it to the front door of the opponent's house, and then call the media to take a photograph of the dead chicken nailed to the door. So I, quickly pointed out that I thought that was trespassing, and it was probably not a good idea to take a dead chicken to the front door of the Conservative candidate and do that. So he obviously cogitated about it and thought about it, and about 3 days later he called me back and he said, I've got the solution. I'm going to nail the dead chicken to the fence, to his front fence. And that, I can't be charged with trespass. So, you all the time are faced in elections with candidates who go off, they're wild. They go off piste. They do their own thing. He did that every second of every day, but he still ran. He still won. And how did he do it? And I think probably what he did was he spoke to everyone. He was pretty strong and pretty simple and pretty passionate. He spoke to the people he needed to speak to. He absolutely kept his messaging simple, and he was incredibly successful at it as a consequence. Now, in terms of the other thing that he did was that he did really well was social media. Many predicted, I think, some years ago that social media would overtake the sphere of political communication. People weren't quite sure how it's going to happen, but I think until Trump, it wasn't a vision that had actually materialized. How did he do it? Well, he spoke his mind, even in the middle of the night, 3:30, he'd get up and have rants on Twitter. That often would be it would bring down other candidates. It would bring down other campaigns. It didn't for Trump. It just bolstered him. People listened. Normal blokes who were just cranky about being told what to do by, whoever it was, women, elites, whatever you want to call them, went, yeah, and he's right. He's got it. He's nailed it. And moreover, he was just a point of difference. He might be a rich dude, to coin the American expression, but he certainly didn't come across like that. In terms of the campaign, he was, unpolished. He was, sort of inane. He was just didn't make sense a lot of the time, but he spoke to people, and he was absolutely different to the other candidates. And people went, "Yeah, what's he going to say today? Wow, yeah, I agree with that. I like that." It was really quite fascinating how that happened. And I think the other thing that he was definitely, futuristic in the way that he did use social media, in particular Twitter, like no other political leader, and either here in Australia, in the UK, or in the US even before him, even though Obama had used social media in campaigning incredibly well. I think one of the things that Obama did that Clinton didn't was, and it's often been talked about, was they ran very local micro campaigns. So they got to understand at a very micro level, if you're in a neighborhood, and there was an issue in your street about, a pedestrian crossing or a light, a traffic light or whatever it was, the Democrats would get involved with that issue. They deal with the minutiae of that issue, and so they'd be solving people's local micro issues. They did that through metrics. They did that by using one, Nation Builder, which, by the way, it's an interesting platform, and it's one that Trump used for this election. In fact, apparently Nation Builder supported all sides of the campaign, supposedly. But he did that micro campaigning very well, and people have said that Hillary didn't do that on this occasion. She used social media, but that local level, local issue campaigning just wasn't as clear and as well articulated. I think in terms of Twitter, he really redefined communications and how social media was used as a tool for not just sending information, but also used as a medium of disruption. I'm using that word again, but intentionally here. He used it as an attack and to cultivate a strong following. How do some of those crazy bloggers, crazy social media identities, how do they go from 53 followers January one year, and by August of the following year they've got 369,000. They do it by being gutsy. They do it by being disruptive. They do it by doing crazy stuff sometimes. And that's what he did. And people liked it. People lapped it up. It was different, very different. He shook it up. His political communications is the reverse of a traditional, careful and more expensive approach relying on free. He relied, in fact, on free, urgent and instinctive modes of communication. He relied on coverage, traditional, free coverage. And he got it in the bucket loads. He got it in spades. Hillary Clinton's campaign paid for a lot of election advertising. He, in turn, got that for free. His messages, his positions, his views were bugled and carried for free through mainstream media. So his approach was certainly controversial, but his medium of communication was very, very futuristic, I think, in many respects. And it was, again, really, in some respects, really back to basics. So I think this is before we get to the end, or this is the last slide, so if anyone's got a question, please pop one into the box. But I think one of the things, what do we say now? Well, now what? I think we really do have to understand these sorts of campaigns. I don't think every campaign is going to look like this, but I think there is a real possibility here in Australia that the rise and rise and rise of not just One Nation and other conservative independence, but all forms of independence is a real phenomena. It's a little obviously different in the States with a two-party system, but here politics is becoming more complex. And in some respects, that's good for democracy because there's a lot more combinations of people that you can lobby and engage with to get outcomes. But it also has the potential for slightly eccentric or scary conservative results to rise up and present themselves, such as we've seen at the last election here in Australia. So I think it's something that we need to think about, and we need to think about very clearly. And how do we respond to this politics of resentment as organisations or as individuals? I think we need to have a think about that. Obviously, we don't want to take on that us and them mentality. We don't want to start shouting at people, but maybe we want to become, occasionally more brash if we think it needs it. If people are being brash, we need to take it up to them and challenge people's thinking, because if you're in a room and people are shouting, if you're sitting in the corner whispering, you probably won't be heard. So it's about thinking about how you're going to have a clear voice, a loud voice, without perhaps, obviously, you don't want to, dwell on or become a part of that resentment. Someone just asked me a question. Because of the recent experience in Brexit and Trump, do I think polling's dead? Well, I think it's certainly in danger. I would, if I was a polling company and I was relying on that as my sole income, I would be really wondering about how I can provide my efficacy to people, to parties. I mean, you've got to remember that polling companies are polling for people all the time. So political organisations are polling. They're in the field all the time, pre, during, just after, every week. Every political party, or the major political parties in Australia. I mean, the Greens probably less so because they don't have as much money. But the major political parties are in the field doing qualitative where people are getting personal feedback in focus groups, quantitative, where they're taking large samples. Now, qualitative, you can recruit people and you bring people to a room and you pay them an incentive, $100 or $75, you give them some food, occasional glass of wine if it's the evening. But when you get a quant poll where people are rung and it was 2,000 people polled, a lot of time you're getting, it's a robo poll. You're getting it's not a person at the other end of the phone. They can't get through to your mobiles. If they can, you can hang up, you can block them. So there's a question about the validity of the methodology of polling because people can't be reached. And I suppose pollsters really do need to think about how they're going to establish that. It then brings forward a really interesting question that you ask, which is then, how do we actually know what's going on? And I think in some respects, Kamara, it's really up to journalists and us to listen to people. And again, we get back to the listening, leading. We need to listen, but we then need to think, well, do we like what we're hearing? Do we want to try and influence that thought? Do we want to try and bring that thought around to face in another direction? So I think that's something we need to think about. I do think that by understanding how communication is used for division, which obviously is what we're seeing at the moment with these 3 different examples, we can also aspire to see how communication is used more often for hope and good as well, which I think sounds like an optimistic way of ending this webinar. But I don't want to be all doom and gloom. But I think we do need to really understand what our opponents are saying and how they are succeeding before we can hope to ever confront them or defeat them, certainly on issues like immigration or terrorism or, Medicare or whatever it might be, immigration, etc., etc. I think we do need to really understand what people are saying and why they're being successful at it before we can really turn that debate around. So that's it for today. If anyone has got any questions, pop them in now because we're just wrapping up. The next webinar is not going to be until February. I thought everyone may need a bit of a rest in January. So it's in February and it's about podcasts, what they are, do I need one, and how to create one. We're going to create one ourselves next year. So as part of my research, I thought it would be good to put together a podcast about a webinar about podcasts rather than the other way around. So have a great break, whatever you do. Thanks very much for joining us today. I'm pleased that you could be with us. And these slides and a recording of this webinar will be available on 50 Acres TV. If you just search 50 Acres TV on Google, it'll come up. We'll also send out a copy of the slide pack and a link to the recording as well. So thank you so much, everyone. Have a great holiday, a great break, and stay safe, drive carefully, and I hope you get lots of presents and have lots of rest by the ocean or wherever else you're going to go. Thank you so much and have a great day.